Well, as they say, and now for something completely different. It's a bit of unremarked history in terms of particularly 19th century children's homes. And it's the fact that, as the Mandela Committee in 1896 put it in their report, almost every children's home has a band. I quote from them. And as far as I've been able to determine, nobody really has picked this up or commented on it or written about it. So it intrigued me. So I started having a look at it, and I've begun to write. The paper I've got so far is rather long, so I didn't circulate it, but if anybody wants a copy after they've heard me, then if you just note your name on a bit of paper, I'll email it to you. Well, the fact that there were so many, particularly boys' brass bands, this is totally a boys' phenomenon, is perhaps less remarkable than you might think, because there was really from the beginning of the 19th century, but particularly thereafter, from the 1850s onwards, a recognisable brass band movement, as it was called, which was a cardinal feature of popular culture. And the legacy, if you like, of this movement went back a long way. To start with, of course, there were church bands before the widespread introduction of the organ, and there, of course, were military bands, and particularly bands established by particularly the commanding officers, militia. First the militia around the time of the Napoleonic Wars, and subsequently when the government reintroduced the militia legislation in the 1850s because of Franco-British tensions, the re-establishment of a widespread and compulsory militia movement. And these militias also set up their bands, typically brass bands, associated with drill, associated with marching, associated with discipline. But it wasn't just these features of the legacy against which one has to see the development of brass bands in children's homes. For example, many industrialists and employers promoted bands. And the idea in that was both to advertise, if you like, the enterprise in public events, but also the belief that playing in a band, and a band that was associated with the image of the enterprise, was good for morale, it was improved productivity, etc., etc. The third legacy really was what were called subscription bands. And these were bands, brass bands, set up by local communities, typically in the north. They started really in Lancashire and then Yorkshire and gradually expanded southwards. But it was pit villages, it was mill towns and so forth. And these were groups of working men coming together and by subscription setting up their own brass bands. So the fact that many of those who ran children's homes thought that a brass band would be a good idea wasn't so remarkable, because there was this existing background of this widespread widespread brass band movement. So there are a number of questions to ask beyond that. The first was, well, why in fact did they create bands in children's homes? And the scale was really quite remarkable, as I'll come to later on. And the second question is, well, what were the predisposing factors that actually allowed or encouraged the setting up of these bands? The third question, I suppose, is, well, what lay in store for these band boys in terms of their subsequent careers, in terms of their subsequent lives? And the last question, which I'll, if there's time, come on to, is to try and place this into a wider sociological context. Well, why create a band in the first place? Well, one of the assumptions was, and it was very widespread among social reformers, that music had some restorative and reformative powers. And in a way, I think perhaps this is best summarised by a very long article that Bernardo wrote for the Musical Herald in about the middle of the 1870s. And if I can paraphrase this, this is what he said. First, he saw it as a means of culture, opening the gates of intelligence, of ideality, his word, of emotion. Secondly, he thought it was invaluable as a means of drill, and drill to music made discipline easier. Thirdly, he promoted music because of the pleasure it gives. Fourthly, music was regarded as an essential handmaiden of religion, especially hymn singing. Finally, he said that his homes couldn't do without it. Music gave the children a priceless heritage of beauty, of culture, of abiding spiritual possession. Well, others may not have used such flamboyant language, but that was a widespread sentiment that music had some restorative and reformative powers, and in terms certainly of social mobilisation, very, very important. Only think of the Salvation Army bands set up in the 1870s, very much about mobilisation. So that was one of the incentives, that was one of the background reasons. A second was that the band was thought to play an important part in raising the profile of the home. And this was very much associated with two things. One, it was associated with public marching. And for example, Bernardo's Stepney Boys' Home had every week, sometimes twice a week, so upwards of 40 of the boys marching through East London behind their band. In fact, that home had two bands, junior and senior. Likewise, many of the bands actually played at public events. For instance, the Wellesley training ship in the North Shields actually advertised that the band was available for hire, and indeed it played throughout the north, particularly the northeast, for many years, and earned a great deal of money for the ship. So there was this advertising element, if you like. It was the public image of a children's home, and also an expression, public expression, which couldn't so easily be achieved simply by building a building as a children's home. This was showing the public that we were doing something significant, and the boys were mastering some particular, as it was then often called, industrial skill. Music playing was seen as an industrial training. So that was a second reason. The third reason why it was promoted so vigorously was that it raised money. And the best example of this is, Bernardo's Musical Boys, so-called. And he organised, for example, many overseas trips for the bands. The most successful one was a tour of Australia and New Zealand, which actually raised £10,000, which in the 1870s, particularly 1880s, was a substantial sum of money. And indeed, from the Bernardo's records, it's clear that the band playing, as it were, for money was an important part of the fundraising agenda, certainly in times when they were very pressed for money. So that money-raising aspect really quite important. And when the bands marched with other children, often there were, usually in fact, collecting boxes, people marching alongside, collecting money from the public along the way. One of the last remaining Homes bands was very near here, and this was the Brixham Seamen's Orphans Boys Home, and their band went on until 1983. And some of the reminiscences of those who played in the band were very interesting. One of which was, of course, to say that they marched every Sunday through Brixham, church parades and so forth, and whilst they were doing it, collections were made en route, though the boys really didn't see any pocket money coming out of those public collections. Now, the third reason was also extremely important in terms of the juvenile labour market, because the band boys could join the military band or a marine band at the age of 14, whereas normally enlistment for boys was 15. And this meant, in a sense, that schools finishing at 14, that these boys could go into what was regarded as a very good disposal, as it was put. It provided them with shelter, food, occupation, and a secure, if you like, niche in the labour market for a good many years, depending on how long they actually enlisted for. So there are some quite interesting things here, and the enlistment was important also, I think, because by comparison with what else happened to 14-year-olds leaving children's homes, this looked a very good proposition. Most of the 14-year-olds who left went into dead-end jobs, and certainly by comparison with the girls, who in 1900, those who left children's homes in London, 97% of them went into domestic service, and at the very low end of the domestic service hierarchy, right at the bottom. So, comparatively speaking, enlistment was regarded both in terms of national patriotism, if you like, in terms of also imperial sentiments. What people talked about was social imperialism or popular imperialism, fed into all that kind of thing. So here are a few reasons why the bands were promoted. But they weren't only promoted in a sense for the external and economic reasons in a public kind of arena. They were also important within the homes themselves. And in some homes they accompanied drill. In certainly some of the big district schools in London, they played at meal times. And Roger told me that he remembered in one approved school that they accompanied the punishment of miscreants whilst they were beaten before the rest of the boys. So, interestingly enough, there was this internal use of the bands as well. Now let me move on to the second question. What were, as it were, the predisposing factors that actually encouraged or allowed people to set up these bands in the children's home? Well, the first and probably the most important was size. The home had to be big enough to support a band. And typically, one of the architects of the district schools, the big district schools in London, Edward Tufnell, one of the inspectors, said that the homes had to have at least 450 children in them if they were going to be mixed. Otherwise, they could not support a band. And one of his arguments in trying to uphold the idea of these large big district schools was that without them you couldn't have a band. So size was quite important, and there were some very big children's homes. For example, Bernardo Stepney Home for boys, that's about 450 boys. biggest probably, which was an interesting exception, was Muller in Bristol, where at the turn of the century there was something over 1,500 children. But Muller actually set his face against having a band, arguing that it was not a reasonable expenditure of donors' money. So in the Muller homes, one of the exceptions, they did not have a band, but he was very enthusiastic about singing, and the children were taught singing a cappella, unaccompanied, tonic solfa system, and so on. And this was a regular feature of what went on in Muller's homes. But there are other kinds of musical events in other homes. There was handbell ringing, and in some of the homes, those in Scotland and in Northern Ireland, one had pipe bands. A few had fife and drum, and typically these were in the poorer homes and in boys' clubs, things like that. So you had this whole question of size. Now, it wasn't just size which was important if you were going to support a band. The other factor was the rate of turnover, because the boys had to stay in the home long enough to be taught, to play, to improve, and to be fit for public performances. And typically, in Bernardo's boys' homes, they stayed between at least 1 to 2 years. So size, turnover, very, very important. The other thing was that this was not a cheap enterprise. With the help of Roger, we've looked at some photographs of boys' bands and looked at the kinds of instruments which they were playing. And one, the Castle Howard Reformatory in Yorkshire, 30-strong boys' band. The list of instruments was really very impressive, wasn't it, Roger? And I got some contemporary price lists from suppliers of musical instruments, and we reckoned that equipping those boys with those instruments would have cost, at the time, about £400, which in present prices is something approaching 20,000 quid. This wasn't a cheap enterprise, and as most of the organisations were frequently strapped for cash, it's some kind of index, some kind of indicator of how enthusiastically the band was promoted. So, but it wasn't just instruments, of course. The boys were decked out in very flamboyant uniforms, usually, very much like regimental uniforms. And these were expensive. They were rarely made in the tailor shops in the homes. They were usually bought from bandsmen's uniform suppliers, which grew enormously from the 1850s onwards. In fact, to give you some idea of how widespread band playing, brass band playing was made, a conservative estimate in the 1880s was that there were 20,000 brass bands in Britain. And this created a market, of course, for instruments and uniforms, and one of the compensating factors was that the price, the cost of instruments began to go down as the market expanded, and particularly as there were imports of cheaper musical instruments, particularly brass instruments from France and Germany. So it was a costly enterprise, but the price was going down. So that's one other factor. And the last one, in a sense, about what the preconditions were, is a very interesting one. And although I said at the beginning this was something entirely different, it does play into some of the other things we've been talking about today. And that's the interesting question of how these boys were taught, and about the whole question of talent. Because most of these boys would have come from pretty deprived backgrounds. I doubt whether any of them had played a musical instrument before, but within a comparatively short time, they were brought to a level where they could engage in public performances, and in some cases play in brass band competitions, and in some cases win. And the question arises about the cultivation of various kinds of latent talents among some of these children. And I know if Sonia Jackson were here, one of our other fellows, who's been a great enthusiast and campaigner for the increasing role of music in the care of looked after children, perhaps there is something here still about the restorative powers of music, and not least of actually playing music, mastering an instrument, and having the kind of pride and sense of achievement that goes with it. And of course, it's unlikely that they would be brass instruments these days, but it is a thought worth bearing in mind. That talent, and to give you some idea of the scale of this achievement, I looked at the statistics for boys leaving poor or children's homes in London in the mid-1880s first, and then in 1900. And in the 1880s, and this will surprise you, I'm sure, 20% of all the boys who left these homes in London joined a military band. And in 1900 it was 28%. This was a big enterprise, not least because band boys were in great demand in the military. We had, at the beginning of the outbreak of the First World War, we had about 150 regiments, each of which had their bands. Most of the large ships of the line had marine bands on board. So there was almost an inexhaustible demand for band boys. An important niche in the juvenile labour market, therefore, was being exploited. Let me turn now to the third question, which is, well, what lay in store for these band boys? And of course, the answer is, by and large, we don't know. We can trace the histories of one or two of them who became bandmasters, more eminent figures in bands, in civilian bands, and so forth. But the thing, as I said before, which I think the promoters, and perhaps the boys themselves, found very attractive, was the fact that they went into a situation where they were fed, they were housed, and where their musical talents were likely to be improved over time through practice and playing and so forth, and not least, certainly by comparison with the girls who went into domestic service, they had some kind of setting in which camaraderie and some mutual support could actually be encouraged. Some would not have had that, but it was a possibility, and so on. There were, however, certain reservations about what lay in store. The Mandela Committee, which I mentioned before, which was looking in 1896 at the education of pauper children in London, warned that there were, or maybe, problems associated with the end of these boys' military service, saying that many of them finished up busking in the roads, playing for money and so forth, because the home had so concentrated on developing their musical skills that other industrial training had not been done, and they weren't equipped to do anything except play musical instruments. So there was that kind of doubt. The other thing, of course, was in terms of what happened to these boys in war, because bandsmen were not fighting soldiers. They didn't carry arms or weapons. And yet they were often placed in some of the most dangerous situations. In the 1914-18 war, for example, the bandsmen formed the major part of the stretcher bearers. And the stretcher bearers went over the top with the infantry, with their stretchers, and they had no kind of protection from breaking machine gun fire or exploding shells. And the casualty list, as far as I've been able to establish it, amongst bandsmen, couldn't determine which had been bands boys, but amongst bandsmen was certainly as high as that amongst frontline infantry. And the same applied, of course, to the ships. If any of you have read C.S. Forster's The Ship, which is a novel, a wartime novel, 1942, about a cruiser protecting a convoy going to Malta, in it he also describes the role of the bandsman on board this light cruiser, not a big ship, and they were responsible for what was called the transmission room. And the transmission room was deep in the bowels of the ship and was responsible for coordinating all the kinds of information which was necessary to be relayed to the gunners. Likewise, David Donniston, one of our fellows who was in the Royal Navy during the war, not here today, told me that in the cruiser where he was, the bandsmen were responsible for the emergency steering of the ship, which was again deep down in the bowels of the vessel. So they were exposed to quite a lot of risks as bandsmen, and certainly the band boys, as they became bandsmen, would certainly have shared these kinds of risks and so on. So there's a limit to what we can say really about what lay in store, but on balance I would think that by comparison, certainly if you read the analysis of the juvenile employment labour market in the 1909 Royal Commission on the Poor Laws, they certainly seemed to be in a better position, to have better prospects than most other 14-year-olds who left school. Likewise the girls. Right, well the final thing before I stop, which I'd like to touch on, is the wider context. And that is, if you like, the politics of bands. And I mentioned the role that bands played in mobilisation of support. And for example, the National Children's Home Band in Bonner Road in London regularly went out marching with other children behind them on Temperance Sundays. And the argument was that it was very important to have the band there, I quote, to drum up support. Likewise, the Salvation Army and other things like this. And if you look, for example, at all kinds of political rallies, look at Nuremberg rallies in Germany, the role of the band, and incidentally in Nuremberg, a lot of the bands were boys' bands, particularly drum bands and so forth. If you look at the role of bands in this wider context, there's another very interesting study to be done. Because they played into, in Britain at least, as I mentioned before, this idea of popular imperialism, patriotism, and these kinds of things. And it's reflected in the fact that it wasn't just bands in children's home, boys' bands. By the 1880s, 1890s, a whole flurry of organisations for boys with bands, military style, was being set up. For example, you had, just to quote three, you had the Boys' Brigade, you had the Church Lads' Brigade, you had the Boys' Life Brigade, Scouts and so forth, all of which had their brigade bands. A lot of marching, a lot of discipline, and again, the role of marching and drill. I was talking earlier to some people here. It interests me when and why the idea of drill in serried ranks to numbers, as it were, was replaced by a PT and later, of course, by PE. So the underlying factor, I think, in the use of bands in a wider sociological context is very closely associated with disciplines, the cultivation of social order in education, in the military, and in employment. So there is a wider context to be looked at here, and I hope that at some point in the future I'll be able to do that. I haven't done it at the moment. Can I finish with just one other quotation to give you a sense of some of the combination of these things, of the marching, of the advertisement, of the fundraising, of the internal role of bands and so forth. And this is a quotation from the House Journal of Fagins Boys' Homes, which was in Deptford. And this is it. In Deptford, the inhabitants were roused by the stirring tones of the drum and fife band, as at the head of 100 young emigrants, it marched steadily on to the New Cross Public Hall, where all interested in the welfare of the lads were invited that they might finally bid Godspeed to the youthful imperial pioneers. So there you have it, marching, public demonstration and so forth. And I hope that these few aspects of this hitherto unremarked phenomenon of the institutional history of children has captured some kind of interest, and we might, if any of you played in brass bands, I know at least 2 people here who did, might have a chat in the afternoon and tell them about their experiences. So that's it. Thank you very much.
So, Roy, what's the legacy of this? Is there any legacy now that you see from all this?
No, I think the last bands disappeared in the 1880s, in the 1980s, as I said, and they disappeared for a number of reasons. One was, of course, that the homes got smaller and the turnover got quicker. So these 2 factors were very important. And if you look at the curve, if you like, of the gradual reduction from the mid-20s onwards of the size of children's home, it goes down and down and down. And alongside that, you also had the development of cottage home complexes, where various kinds of cottages were set up with 6 to 10 children in them, with a house mother and so forth. And unless there was a strong kind of centralising sentiment there, that didn't really lend itself to the kind of creation of a band. You know, where did they store their instruments? Where did they practice? It was more fragmented. So both the reduction in size and the fragmentation of the establishments was, I think, quite important.
Could I add another factor, Roy, see what you think about it? Because certainly when I entered social work at the end of the 60s, one of the things drummed into me is that you made sure that children in care were not singled out in any way, and that the normalisation that they shouldn't be seen as different from other children. So that whole notion of them marching in a band and being public would have been totally natural.
And this would have been re-emphasised by the wearing of these regimental style uniforms of the band. And of course it was a time when most of the homes equipped their children with uniforms of one kind or another anyway.
Yeah,
so they were identified. But it seemed to me there are 2 sides of that. For the band boys, it lent something which may have enhanced their pride, their sense of identity, and some of these things we tend to forget about. The role of even the institution or even the small home in creating a base for some kind of sense of identity for those who may be lacking or have a weak sense of identity.
I was quite delighted that the band boys, B-A-N-N-E-D, became the band boys.
Yes, that's nice. I just bear that one in mind. Yes.
But it's still relevant now, because apparently kids with very overreactive neurological patterns, like a lot of the traumatised kids in care, respond very positively to rhythmic sounds.
Absolutely.
And so, in a sense, the marching, the band, the repetition of the noise is very calming.
And in fact, if certainly from my own childhood experience, if you heard a band, it had a magnetic effect, certainly on children. They fell in beside and they all marched along, and there is something about particularly the rhythm, the marching rhythm, I think, which is, as I say, rather magnetic. And I'm sure the boys in these homes would not have been isolated from that kind of sentiment. And I think, well, I've read some of the accounts that band boys have written from bands that went on into the 20th century, and they felt that they were special. They felt that the public applause that they got when they marched, when they played at events. The events they typically played at were football matches. At the beginning, at half-time, they marched up and down and played, and the Brixham Boys' Home here regularly played at football matches at Torquay, at Exeter, and at Plymouth. And the home was paid for this, you know? So, and at fetes and at galas, and so, now, of course, you have the miners' galas and Durham and so forth, the marching, the playing. It was, and I think still is in a way, an important part of popular culture.
And I thought Lenny Henry did a marvellous radio programme once about music and its importance, and it started in Africa, as all humans did, and it was a very cohesive experience. There was music accompanied every event that people joined into, and of course then it transferred into blues and jazz, which I love, but I think it is a very community cohesive force, music, that we share.
The idea of promoting talent, particularly in disadvantaged children, I mean, two examples come to mind. One is Dudamel in Venezuela with the orchestra.
Yes,
It's
yes,
slightly different,
yes.
but I mean, it seems to have had an effect on children. I think it's been replicated in Scotland.
Yes.
And the other one is different about Africa. There's something called Basque Aid, which is a classical string academy now in Soweto, which was started by a viola player called Rosemary Nalden, who started a very thriving string school and orchestra in Soweto. And she describes some of the children are extremely disadvantaged, some of the AIDS orphans and so on, and a few of them have become extremely talented, and in fact they raise their own funds by touring and playing in Africa and actually all over the world now. And again, I mean, that's more the sort of helping disadvantaged children through music and encouraging talent.
You mentioned the Temperance Society, and I just wanted to, my assumption is there was quite a crossover between the, thinking about temperance and keeping people out of the pubs and off the streets in the popular band movement. But I just wondered, and I say my father was a captain of the Church House Brigade, and my brother played the bugle, and they did actually play at Manchester City. And it was City, not United, because United was Catholic and we were Protestant, so there were all those, and marching in the Whit Walks, if anyone's up in the northwest, the bands would all walk along, Catholics one Sunday, Protestants the next. Anyway, but I also wondered whether, it was just a thought, that aspiring or caring poor working class parents, would they try and actually get their kids into Bernardo's homes because they could see a way out for their kids? And it's just a sort of, you can see if you were near one and that those kids were there and you couldn't afford to feed your children and you saw a career.
Well, yes, in the sense that some did rather than the poor law system. Yes. They didn't want the child going to the poor law, it's kind of stigma, so some did apply to Bernardo's, but the recruitment of children to Bernardo's, a lot of it was done through local, what did he call them? Kind of people, referees almost, who went round, identified families in need, and then suggested that they should send their child to Bernardo's. So there was a very active, and it was the same for the waifs and strays. Most of the waifs and strays came from local churches and organisations where members of the congregation would identify poor families and suggest.
And the NCA is not the same.
The difference between then and now is, talking of schools, you get individual schools with quite interesting music programs and so on, but it tends to be hit and miss on whether a teacher has a particular talent. Like, can somebody play the piano? Oh, they will have a sing-song. Whereas what you're talking about was clearly part of the structure expected. And that's rather different from the sort of hit and miss of talented
Let me
teachers.
just say, as a point of personal reference, really, I chair the Music Education Hub in the city of Bristol, which is part of the Colston Hall, which provides music education across the city. And we've launched a project which has now been running for some 5 years called Preludes, that is putting orchestral training into the most deprived primary schools in the city, starting with the reception class as a percussion orchestra. And within a year, you can have every child in a primary school playing to their parents and the rest of the school with the kind of pride and in a percussion orchestra. And a particular school which has just come out of special measures called Ilminster Avenue in Bristol, I think in a month's time, it's taking its orchestra, which is now 5 years old, which is inclusive, to play at Sherborne School. Okay, so there are things going on in a kind of planned way which do support.
But the other thing to mention about the brass band movement is it was a working class movement. If you look at music in the public schools, which Roger knows something about, you get a very different picture. This is string quartets and, school orchestras.
Well, but the point about this particular programme is that you're introducing cello and violin when the children are 5 and 6 and 7. I think it's only your point about some schools now. There's a school called Galleons in London where every child is introduced to the violin. The whole school plays an instrument. There's no exception. And of course the performance of the school, but the performance of the school academically seems to have shot up, and behaviour reduced, and exclusions down, and attendance up. And so it's a very powerful tool, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now I've got the floor. Firstly, I'd like to thank you, Roy, because I'm always inspired when you speak, and the way that you can hold us all in your hand for 40 minutes and talk on a subject which may seem obscure, but is absolutely captivating. So thank you. Second, I was in a marching band. I went to America for a year, and in America, marching bands are in every single high school. I played the flute. It's utterly irrelevant because you can't hear a flute in a marching band.
Well, drum and fife bands.
Yeah. And I marched at Mile High Stadium in Denver, and it was very normal for high school bands to go to big sporting events. Anyway, my question is, what about the girls? What opportunities were there for them? And if there weren't any, why was that?
Well, the assumption was that brass bands were, the popular culture. There weren't any women in brass bands really until quite late on in the 20th century. The only musical education that girls got was singing, typically. And some also had handbell ringing. But the singing was closely associated with hymn singing and church and so forth. And again, this emphasises the close relationship in the 19th century between music and religion. And that was very strong. So I think, generally speaking, if you look at what the girls did in the homes and after, by comparison with the boys, they had a rough deal. They were doing laundry work, they were doing scrubbing in the homes, and that's basically what they continued to do afterwards.
Folk dancing was inclusive for girls.
Sorry?
Folk dancing.
Folk dancing? Yes.
Interesting, America, of course, invented the majorette, which made the bands more equal gender terms.
Yeah.
No equivalent here, apart from the Dagenham Girl Piper or something like that.
Yes.
So Roy, why brass?
Brass, two things. There was the legacy, that there were lots of brass bands anyway, and I don't know why that should have been the form of the music playing that developed in the early 19th century. But the two factors that were important was that brass instruments were cheaper than other instruments by and large, and brass instruments, because of various technical improvements in the instruments, became much easier to play from about the 1850s, 1860s onwards. Roger can say something about this. they had previously been difficult, certainly brass instruments, difficult to play and to learn and to master because of technical changes in design of the instruments after about, I think about mid-1850s. It became an easier instrument, or easier instruments to master.
Yeah, but I mean, you didn't have a hunting violin or a hunting cello. It wouldn't stand up to the English climate, but you did have hunting horns.
Yes.
And you did have buglers in armies going back to the Middle Ages as a way of giving instructions as to what to do next. So that those sorts of aspects of the longer-term tradition of brass being weatherproof, more weatherproof than other instruments.
Yeah, but the other thing, of course, they were also closely associated with drums. And the drums, in some ways, were more difficult to maintain, and probably is more expensive in some ways because of the maintenance costs and replacements and so on.
Was there possibly a step change in the design of valves on
Yes,
these instruments?
yes, it was the valve, changes in valve design.
Did you discover in your researches whether the Foundling Hospital used bands at all? I'm sure they've got a set of handbells in their museum. It's quite interesting because it became the school that I went to in Berkhamsted in Hertfordshire. They moved out in the 1960s, before the war actually. But they didn't become a school open to local children until the 60s. And it was built with completely identical two sides of it for girls and boys who only met on Sundays in the chapel in the middle. So it was built of sort of two sides reflecting each other, but they didn't meet. So it remained quite militaristic and old-fashioned until the middle of the last century. Well, I just wondered if you had to just come across whether they had a band or anything like that.
I haven't checked that one out. I mean, there were so many institutions that it's, and certainly the reformatories and the industrial schools. They also had bands if they were large enough, and of course they had the advantage of having a very slow turnover because boys were committed for long periods.
Yes.
And in fact the biggest industrial school in the end of the 19th century was Felton, and they had something like 800 boys, and they boasted two bands. And the philanthropic farm school at Red Hill, which didn't have so many boys, it was I think about 450, 500. They had two bands, and I'm not quite sure what this meant, but I read they had a reed band as well. So 450 boys supporting three bands. And the local government board inspectors, not the local government board inspectors, check, the inspector of reformatories and industrial schools, on his visits in the 1880s, he was very scathing about what was being done at the philanthropic farm school and said it was inadequate here and inadequate there. The only thing that could be applauded was their bands.
The issue of the inspector, was it Tottenham objecting to the reduction in size because they couldn't maintain a band, continued. In 1950, Barbara Kahan, who was the forceful director of Children's Services in Oxfordshire, wanted to open a new home in Kidlington for 8 beds. And she showed me a letter from the Home Office which said, this is an interesting idea, but totally impractical. 8 isn't even large enough to form a football team. And in the letter in 1950, from the Home Office, quashing her plan for a smaller unit.
Yes.
And in fact, the development of very large comprehensive schools has been driven by the need to generate an academic sixth form of 150 youngsters. So you need a huge base of youngsters of 10 forms of entry to get, the 150 elite students at the top, which is kind of counterintuitive, really. Definitely.
Can I ask a question? Are there parallels? Was it the same or different in other European countries?
It was particularly in the States, Australia, New Zealand, and Germany. In France, it was slightly different because the fanfare, the bands, the village bands, by and large didn't march, which was interesting. They just played at events. So the marching aspect, although bands were widespread, pretty well throughout Europe, marching wasn't as widespread, an association with it, you know?
Yeah.
And that I always found quite interesting.
We looked at the music that they were playing. What kind of music and who was writing it, and the tutors of these bands? I mean, where did they come from?
Well, this is an interesting question, but I haven't been able to answer it. The bandmasters who were appointed, typically they had been former regimental bandmasters, etc. How they taught, whether the boys actually learned to read music, how the practice was done, how you, in a sense, from zero, get 30, 50, I mean the Norwood home had a band of 50 boys. How you get that level of ability in a short period of time is a very interesting question. So yes, to answer your question, it was widespread, but the brass bands were widespread, but not the marching so much.
I'll make a couple of quick comments. First is just reflecting on the similarities, some of the relationship to children's services activity today. And some of we talked about via email, but it's interesting to look at some of the things that seem to be important in brass bands and some of the rationale for them in relation to interventions being developed today, prevention, early intervention type interventions. We've just done a review of the value of extracurricular activities and what the research says about the value of them for children's development and health and general well-being. And some of the things that come out a lot are the importance, obviously, of building good relationships with people, bonding with significant adults, the value of having opportunities, being able to develop skills, having your achievement recognised and being praised, and all those kinds of things. So there seems to me there's something called the social development model, which is developed by some researchers in Washington State University, which is very influential and underpins a lot of evidence-based programs today. And there's something called the youth development model, which is similar and kind of underpins a lot of kind of youth development type interventions and sports and other kind of cultural type interventions. So I think there's a very interesting parallel there. And I've got a question as well, which is that on a couple of occasions you've kind of inferred that the public were interested in the bands and in the homes and in the welfare of the boys, yes. Which I find quite interesting, because my sense is today, apart from groups like CSP, people, the broader public is not terribly interested in the welfare of children in children's homes and so on. So I'm kind of interested in why there was that interest. Was it because people were giving money to the homes and therefore they wanted to know that their money was going to good causes? Or
one has to put it into a cultural context, in the sense that for most of the period I've been talking about, if you wanted music, you had to make it. It was before recorded music, it was before radio, certainly before television. And one of the assets that the boys would have had is that they had this capacity to engage in domestic music making. I mean, they were in demand, if you like. And if you look at the geographical distribution, even now, bandstands, really quite interesting. I mean, the band still exists, the Totnes Town Band, got one here. You know, I think this, it's in a sense pre the music recorded and other kind of music explosion. And it's not as if the children looked after children aren't interested in music. They're very deeply interested in their particular kind of music. So it isn't a blank slate, if you like, musically speaking.
There's all that Victorian sense of social reform and philanthropy and injecting money into things that are seen as good for reform, good for the reform of the individual as well as general.
And I certainly feel convinced that there still is something to be said for the restorative power of music.
Yes, Dr. Hugh Jolly in the 1960s and 70s at Charing Cross Hospital, he felt that all the children coming before him would be assessed in relation to the input of music therapy. He was a great exponent of that.
Was he? Yes, it's interesting.
Going back to the context, it's quite interesting. When I first came here in 1968, I played in an orchestra in Torquay next to a man of 85 who played in Manchester as a young man, so that would have been before the First World War. And he told me about musical life in Manchester. There were a whole group of musicians, self-employed, who went to a cafe in the morning, because every cafe, every cinema, theatre, had bands.
Yes.
And people used to come in and say, who's available today to play in the Cardova Cafe or whatever it was, violin or cello. And even in the Halley Orchestra, Hamilton Harty used to come round and recruit an orchestra in the morning from the cafe to play a rehearsal in the afternoon and perform in the evening. And in the interval he came round with a bag of half-crowns and paid them. So there was this cluster of musicians who were playing in all sorts of places,
yes,
who were just hired on the spot.
Yeah.
And presumably the more successful bandsmen who went, rather than busking the street like now, they were probably part of this kind of journeyman high on fire, because of all the places that had live music.
Yep.
Well, I think on... Sorry.
Is there a shift in the social demographic of people who take up music today, young people who play music compared to 50, 100 years ago? And the reason I ask is that both my parents are music teachers, and it seems to me that there's been a big shift actually in terms of government support and funding, that now it's incredibly expensive to train in music and to join a youth orchestra, to become good at violin, piano, and you'll see I imagine you would see a big shift in demographic of those who take up.
I think being slightly involved in, I think there has been a major shift in that the funding for music, which used to be lodged with the Department for Education, has now been transferred by them to the Arts Council, and the Arts Council has made all those old local authority music services rebid for the contract against very specific criteria, and not all of them have won contracts. So I think there's a big new investment in the thinking about provision, and certainly there is a requirement now that every school has a music education plan, which is overseen by a music education hub, that every school provides a term's worth of free access to a musical instrument in primary schools. Yes, and that a local authority area, through its music education hub, ought to demonstrate that there is access to ensemble playing and a range of orchestral opportunities, and that every child should sing in primary schools on a day, on a weekly basis. And so I think there is, and that of course is inclusive. It's across the piece, and so I think there is some hope, really. I hope.
But there's also lots of
nationally, nationally.
Several of my grandchildren play in groups, and it's informal groups. It's not from school necessarily, so the whole sort of pop music. And where I live, the pubs is full of people playing music.
Yes,
much more than it was.
Yes, I think traditionally, I think what Stefan is saying is probably right. And actually, what Music Service did was to meet a kind of demand. Said, oh, that school can have some drumming, because they're a working class school on the estate. Whereas the elite orchestras were populated by the private schools and the kind of leafy shires and so on. I think that is changing, and there's a huge demand now by the Arts Council for you to demonstrate that you're being diverse and inclusive, and that youngsters from all sorts of backgrounds get. Which is why this particular Preludes project in Bristol, for instance, is putting elite classical music training into the most deprived primary schools. It's not sending in, a set of accordions or whatever. It's trying to raise the bar. It's not the
brass band into the public school.
Absolutely. I think on that music
there is actually, I think, when I last checked, only one major public school with a brass band.
We've obviously become a national kind of repository of this information, which is the way.
But I still, despite all these developments, I think I would end by asking that more reflection is given to the role of music amongst looked after children in particular.
But for all children, Roy, the standards agenda of this government and the idea of an e-back of particular courses is driving music and other art forms out of our secondary schools, because youngsters are not allowed. They need to take the sciences, the maths, and the English, and the foreign language, and the luxury of doing a dance GCSE or a music GCSE and so on is getting squeezed out. And that's a very serious issue.
We could do it in prisons too.
Okay, well I think
Yes.
I'm going to thank Roy, and we should thank Roy indeed for a really interesting